Thank you. Well, it's really nice to be here, and it's always a great thing when I get to do something that my father did previously. So, what a pleasure, and what an interesting morning. So, some of you know about that Stanford's business school dates back almost 100 years, and the reason it was set up, this is back in 1925. There was a concern at the time. Silicon Valley at that time was just farmland. And there was a concern at the time that all of the best young talent, the most promising business talent in the West, was going east for business school and staying there. And of course, that's there's a little bit of irony there now, because now our students come from all over, and occasionally we're worried that they'll never leave California. And the evolution of the school really dates to the first digital revolution. It dates to the birth of the semiconductor industry in the 1950s, which was a collaboration between industry and Stanford University, and led to Silicon Valley and to venture capital in the computer industry and so on. And so what I thought I would talk about today, in keeping with the theme of this conference, was to spend a little bit of time talking about the current digital revolution, by which I mean the rise of algorithms and artificial intelligence and automation, which is reshaping so many aspects of business and society. And this morning already raised a lot of insightful points, so I'm going to try to reinforce some of them and maybe add a few more about the implications for business schools. So let me start by just saying, I think Joe started off this morning by saying putting in context a little bit the current transformation of the economy. And I think actually one thing that's useful to say is we've had a digital revolution for a long time. What is different about today's revolution is really a data revolution. It's a change in the availability of data about all of us and about objects, and then uses of that data. And how consequential is it? Well, McKinsey, many of you may have seen McKinsey's report of a year or two ago, where they estimated that 15% of jobs in the world could be automated by 2025 and 50% by 2050. So that's within the career horizons of all of our students. And as Joe said this morning, those are huge numbers, but those are numbers that we've seen before. In 1900, we had 50% of the U.S. workforce in agriculture, and we have 2% today. In 1950, we had 30% of the workforce in manufacturing. Today, it's less than 10%. And those historical episodes, by the way, provide many pieces of guidance for what the future might hold. One thing they tell us is that although automation replaces a lot of jobs, it also creates many new ones. And that happens both at the level of the macro economy, but also at the micro level. So if you think about something like the first computer revolution, the mainframe computer, when it was first adopted in 1960, it eliminated millions of jobs that were bookkeeping jobs. But it created even more millions of jobs that were business analytics jobs. And of course, the employment rate has really didn't fall at all in the 20th century. But exactly how those changes were going to occur were not that easily foreseeable at the time. So some of you may know that in the 1960s, there was tremendous concern that automation would lead to widespread job loss. Actually, it happened in the 1930s as well. In fact, in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, convened a blue ribbon panel, and he tasked them with thinking about what would happen if there was widespread job loss from automation. How should society respond? And the committee came back and concluded that it was not likely to happen in the near future, but that as a hedge against it happening, the U.S. ought to adopt a guaranteed minimum income for all families. It's actually a little bit foreshadows today people's ideas that we should have universal basic income. It was the same idea, but just 50 years ago. So it's sort of hard to foresee how the changes will occur. Another point that we can learn from the past is that automation has a tendency to shift income from labor to capital, and from low-skill to high-skill workers. And of course, for much of the 20th century, those forces were offset by other things going on in the economy, like the general rise of education and new job creation. And it's less clear that that's happening today in the last 30 years. And a third point is that when you think about prior episodes of rapid technological change, the most important effects have largely occurred in some sense outside the workforce. So think about the Industrial Revolution. Not only did it change jobs, it led to mass urbanization. It led to things like compulsory schooling. So, if you think about what will happen in the next 50 years, probably the biggest effects will be things that will be outside of the direct, they'll be the indirect effects that are hard for us to foresee. So I'm going to come back to some of those points. But let me just say, one of the questions I think that's interesting to ask is, will the next generation of technological change be, in a sense, the same or different than prior ones? And I think that's a hard question to answer. There's many reasons to think it will be the same. There's a few reasons to think that it will be actually quite different. One of them is the pace, and another one is that most automation historically has been about routine tasks, but there is some reason to think that the current set of technologies will be able to do some things that are non-routine, that are less routine than prior automation. So if you think about, many of you may have read about Google's DeepMind, the algorithm they have for playing Go. When they did the original version of the AlphaGo, it was constructed based on a lot of detailed knowledge about how the game worked. By the time they got to their third and fourth versions of those algorithms, they didn't use any structure of the game. They just were generic reinforcement learning algorithms. In fact, the most recent version learned how to play Go at a level better than anything else in 24 hours. In fact, in that same 24 hours, it also became superhuman at chess. That was just its side learning during the 24 hours. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. Now, of course, it's also true that algorithms today are incredibly stupid. So here's an example. Last year, when we had a big set of wildfires in Southern California, and some of you may have read that during those wildfires, the city of Los Angeles had to tell people to stop using navigation apps. Why? Because navigation apps route people to areas where there's no traffic. It's just that at that time, the areas with no traffic were on fire. So that's a non-routine type of learning. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that all of the technologies that are being developed today are dual-use technologies. They're technologies that have the potential to be used for great good in things like healthcare and education and productivity and so forth, but they can also be used to do things like create autonomous weapons systems and to monitor citizens, and for many uses that are very concerning. And I want to come back to that point in a minute. Okay, so that was just sort of give a little context for the types of changes that we've been thinking about, and I'm sure all of you have been thinking about in terms of what it means to prepare students and prepare leaders for the future. So let me just try to say a few things about how that might matter for business education. So I'll start with a piece of good news, which is, one piece of good news, of course, is that the most difficult skills to automate are the ones that we teach. They're how to communicate with people, how to manage people, how to lead organizations, how to collaborate, how to be effective workers in teams. And so in some sense, people talk about the threats to management education, but really we should be talking about the ascendancy of the skills that are involved in management education, because these are the skills that will be most rewarded in the future when more routine tasks are automated. But it doesn't mean that we should just do things the same as we've been doing them in the past, because, in a sense, it also should cause us to think about what exactly are the skills that we're teaching. And let me suggest two areas that we've been thinking about that we think are important for the future, and at least we have not been necessarily doing in the way that we have that we think we ought to be doing them now. So the first is thinking about how to prepare students to be data literate. And by data literate, I don't mean preparing, in our case, MBA students to be able to code neural networks or things like that. Some of them might be doing that in the future, but most of them won't be. What it means is being able to think in a way that you can integrate algorithms and data with business processes and into organizations, and be able to think in a way where you can, for example, state hypotheses that can be tested and evaluated using data. Or as another way to put it was how to be effective translators, having the ability to move back and forth between analytics and data and algorithms to be able to communicate with customers and employees and investors and to think about business models and business processes. And so that's something that we have been thinking in our programs about how to incorporate, and trying to do it in several ways. So one of the ways we've been doing it is to think about the core skills that we teach students. So over the last 2 years, we have a class, Introduction to Statistics class, that we require of all our students. And over the last 2 years, that was a class we redesigned. We actually did it in two ways. One is we made it a flipped class. So we put the lectures on video, and then the students get data from companies, and they work in teams on the data. So it became a much more experiential learning class. In fact, that actually worked very well. We've had a fair amount of experience with flipped classes. Sometimes it's worked well, sometimes it has not worked as well. That worked fabulously, and so well that we've now flipped several more of our core classes this year. The second is that, actually, and this came about because of the change in pedagogy, the faculty rethought that class completely. And so it has a very rigorous foundation, but it's also very hands-on working with data. And that class now takes every student who comes through our MBA program, even people who come from a humanities undergraduate degree, and by the end of the course, they're running machine learning regressions. Not, a lot of machine learning regressions, but they're doing a little bit of machine learning to finish the quarter. And of course, we're also offering more classes that build on those skills, either in the business school, or one of the things that we try to do quite a lot at Stanford, and I know many of you do, is we have students take classes all around the university. And about 20% of our students, in fact, do a second degree during the time they're doing an MBA, but pretty much all of them have the opportunity or do some amount of taking classes in other schools. And just to give you a sense of how much interest there is at Stanford in skills like thinking about artificial intelligence. I've been at Stanford for almost 20 years on the faculty. For many, many years at Stanford, the most highly enrolled class was Economics 1. And then it became Introduction to Computer Science. This year, the most highly enrolled class is Graduate Machine Learning. It had over 1,000 students enrolled this quarter in Graduate Machine Learning, CS 229. And then we offer a lot of classes that highlight opportunities for business creation or business innovation that are enabled by technology. And the model we tend to use for those classes, which I know some of you do as well, is a model where we pair up academic faculty and practitioners and have them teach together, the course together, with a co-teaching model. Actually, about 50% of our elective units are taught using that co-teaching model, and we rely very heavily on our alumni for that, to identify who would be great teachers and really understand the school. And so many people come from Silicon Valley, they're investors or entrepreneurs, but people come from all over the country, in fact, to teach those classes, and we do that to some extent by having classes that are different lengths, so short 2-week classes or 3-week classes that allow us to bring people in to co-teach from all around the US and around the world. And of course, one of the reasons those classes appeal so much to students is it's a way to identify business opportunities. About 15 or 20% of our students start a business right out of the MBA program. And a lot of them, and Jan Smolbach is sitting here in the front row, I see, who started Coinstar out of a Stanford dorm room. And so many of the students in those classes come up with ideas for businesses and then launch them. And the last thing we think about in those classes is we try to bring a lot of students in from other schools, in particular engineering students, with the theory that part of what will enable students in the future to be effective in data-driven organizations is being able to work in a cross-disciplinary way. And I know that that's something that many of you are also thinking about. Okay, let me make one other point about education. So all the points I made so far were about skill acquisition. So let me say one other thing, which is something that I think we've just begun to think about, and I don't know how that we've necessarily come up with the right answers here, but I think actually it's quite an important issue we view it as quite an important issue in educating our students, which has to do with the idea of preparing students to be not just effective users of technology for the business, but to be business leaders who will be thoughtful and ethical in the way they deploy technology. So I already mentioned some issues around things like job displacement and inequality, but think about the challenges today that are facing big technology firms. Many of the biggest challenges they face are around the way in which they're using data and algorithms and the social implications of the decisions they're making. So think about, for example, the problems at companies like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. These companies are making decisions about their algorithms and about the way they run their platforms and their business processes that, when you put them together, determine, in large part, a lot of the information that people in this country receive. So if you're a leader of one of those companies, what are the questions you have to think about? They're questions about how do you balance free speech with a desire to avoid extremism and polarization? You have to think about the demands not just of your customers, but your employees and their values. You have to think about the government in a way that you did not in Silicon Valley have to think about the government 5 years ago. Now you have to think about the government all the time. That's a lot of competing demands. It's almost like being a business school dean. It's not just technology firms. Lots of firms are going to face these questions. I'll give you one more example. So we had a student at Stanford last year. She was an engineering student. She did a study on facial recognition, which just looked at commercial applications of facial recognition. So one of the findings she had was that commercial facial recognition software had about a 99% accuracy rate on identifying white males and less than an 80% accuracy rate in identifying dark-skinned females. Now, why did that bias come about? It wasn't because someone intentionally wrote the algorithms to be biased. It wasn't even anyone noticed that. It was just, that was the nature of the training data. It's just an unforeseen consequence of bringing this technology. Now think about the implication of something like that. If you deployed a technology like that, for example, in an airport to see who would be allowed into the country, or in a retail environment, which, by the way, if you're in China, they use facial recognition in retail environments to figure out, what was the customer service you'd offer to people. Many, many businesses will have issues like that come up in the future. And so it's going to be really important for us to think about how do we prepare students to make good decisions. So that's something we've been thinking about a lot. And some of the things we've been trying to do there are, for example, we teach an ethics class to all the first-year students, trying to bring in questions about algorithms and AI and privacy into that ethics class, trying to bring ethics more into our technology classes. We send most of our students, all of our students on a global experience, most of them on global study trips. We've been sending a number of those trips domestically to look at automation in the US. We've been sending some of them to China to look at AI. We have many speakers who come to our campus who talk about how great they've done with their technology firms. We've been trying to bring more speakers to campus who talk about how things can go wrong in technology firms. Actually, our most discussed talk last year at Stanford at the business school was a talk by an early Facebook employee, a fellow named Chamath Palihapitiya, who gave a talk about how addictive its algorithms were and how much he regretted being part of the development of those algorithms. It was a very interesting talk. Actually, became very controversial when it went on YouTube. And then we're trying to design some classes that explicitly deal with this. So one of the classes I'm very excited about this year at Stanford is a class that's being co-taught by one of our marketing faculty, a woman named Jennifer Acker, who's a social psychologist, and a woman named Fei-Fei Li, who's a computer scientist who runs the Stanford AI lab. And it's a class that's about how do you design AI systems that will augment humans rather than diminish them. It's called Designing AI to Cultivate Human Well-Being. So that's going to be for engineering students and MBA students, and I'm quite excited about it. I think in the future we'll hopefully have a whole lot of classes like that that integrate the technical side with the social science and the humanistic side, so we can think in a more sophisticated, thoughtful way about technology. Okay, so I just talked about, that was mostly about business education. I just want to finish by saying a few things about the research mission of business schools when it comes to some of these questions. I think many of you may have been undergoing this transition as well, but one of the things that's been happening at Stanford on our faculty is we have been adding many faculty who have expertise in things like data science and machine learning and AI. That's been perhaps one of our biggest growth areas on the faculty, actually in all of the subgroups, not just in sort of data science and operations, but across all of our groups. And we've had to invest very significantly to support the work that they do. But I think it's actually a very good investment, because if you think about the topics that I've mentioned, all these different important topics about the future of work, about how to manage automation in a way that's going to augment workers, about how to ensure algorithms are fair, about how to use data responsibly, thinking about how AI is going to affect economic growth and national competitiveness. These are all questions that just call out for better thinking and clear frameworks and so forth. And where are those questions going to be answered if not in business schools at some level, which are already inherently interdisciplinary in nature? But they won't just be answered in business schools. They'll be really best answered by bringing together people from different areas. And so one of the things that we've been very focused on over the last year or two at Stanford is trying to build connections across the university to get faculty together to work on some of these issues. Actually, last year we did a seed grant program with the Stanford AI Lab, which was for faculty teams who wanted to do research on the implications of artificial intelligence. We thought we would get about 20 proposals or something like that. We got 100 proposals from faculty teams across Stanford, which was a little surprising and fabulous, a little surprising, and we had to go back and get a lot more money, so that was a little challenging too, but it did work out. And that was a little bit of a trial balloon for an initiative we're going to launch later this year around human-centered artificial intelligence, which will bring together faculty from all 7 of Stanford's schools, education and medicine and business and humanities and sciences and engineering and so forth, with the vision of trying to both develop applications of technology that will advance human good, and also to think about the implications of the next generation of technology. And that's something that I'm really quite excited about. I think that's going to be a great thing for our school and a great thing for the university, and hopefully will be good generally for the world. And I think it's something that, being in Silicon Valley and having been the beneficiary of a lot of technology development, it's something that we feel is actually sort of, in some sense, a responsibility for the university to be thinking about making sure that the next generation of technology actually does work for the broad benefit of humanity. Okay, so that's sort of the main things that I wanted to say, and I'd be happy to just take some questions and see what you guys would like to talk about. Should I cold call someone? Yes.
Yeah, to my best knowledge, and AI and statistics, they can complementary. So you think your statistical combined with AI, is that what you do?
I think that...
Machine learning, I'm sorry. Machine learning. Nature have a paper talking about how the different way to deal with a problem.
Okay, so I think they're intersecting, but not the same. I mean, AI is basically about how do you automate tasks. Machine learning is statistics, about predictive models for statistics. But much of AI is using machine learning to automate tasks. There's other parts of AI that's not about using machine learning. That's more traditional expert systems, which the research has sort of gone away from that. But that was historically a big part of AI research.
What kind of mathematics
Oh, our MBAs come from all over. I mean, many of our MBAs are humanities majors. And a third of them or so are engineers, and then many of them are from social sciences, and they come from all, they come from all different backgrounds.
Dean Levin, thank you very much for being here. I enjoyed your remarks. Blair Sanford, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'd like to probe a little bit more deeply on your comments related to ethics.
Yeah.
Specifically the core course in ethics and who you have involved teaching that particular course, how that gets disseminated to all of your students in the first year.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. Okay, so the way we do ethics is we have a core class on ethics that's taught by faculty. Right now, it's taught by faculty who, the two faculty who teach that class we're both trained in political science, and they teach a class about ethical frameworks. And then we have electives classes that deal with ethics, and those are more ethics in context. So one of the classes we have that's, I think, just a fabulous class is taught by a practitioner, a lecturer, which is a class on essentially a class on real-world ethics. It's a case study class where the cases are basically all cases that just pose some ethical dilemma, but in a non-obvious way. So for example, the case might be something like, you're an entrepreneur, you've agreed to a term sheet with a venture capitalist, and you get a better term sheet. What do you do? It's a hard question, because who is your allegiance to? Is it to your word? Is it to the person that you made the deal with? Is it to your employees and your investors who would like you to take the better term sheet? And then there's no right answer. I mean, and then it's a class is based on role play. So it's, and the thing that we've been thinking about doing now, Stanford, we have a bunch of programs at Stanford that are basically helping students learn entrepreneurial decision making. And I think some of the things that have happened in Silicon Valley over the last recent years, where people have really pushed the line in terms of the way they've run businesses, have caused some of the people running those programs to think about how could we incorporate more discussion of ethical decision making, both ethical decision making around how you run your business and in terms of what the implications of your products will be. So it's, I think it's a good time to be thinking about those questions, particularly as they pertain to technology. Yes.
Hi, Jonathan. You said something really interesting. The most difficult skills to automate are the smart skills, the people skills, the human skills, right? What I've noticed is in the past couple of years, there's a trend to bring a lot of AI in customer service experience, in trying to deal with humans, so you reduce the friction between people. Do you have any examples or any thoughts about how you do blend human skills with artificial intelligence to provide a better customer service?
So I think there's a very interesting question. This sort of gets to the question about designing technology that substitutes for humans or augments humans. And some of the technologies that are being introduced, we were talking last night at dinner about having robot TAs for classes, for example, which is something that could be possible in online classes. It probably already is to some extent possible to automate the answers to many of the questions in the chat forums and so forth. That's a replacing technology versus something like a decision-making aid for physicians, which is an augmenting technology. And it's hard to predict where the technology will go, but I think we should hope for the future of our labor force that we'd get more augmenting technologies than replacing technology. I mean, we need some replacing technologies because that leads to efficiency gains. But I think we also want to think about augmenting technologies. And I think that's actually a good challenge for our students who want to be innovators, to think about what are the opportunities to do that in ways they can make the workforce more efficient and productive using technology, but not getting rid of their jobs.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question about curriculum? Following up on Loriana's comment on the last panel about hard and soft skills, what is most easily outsourced to AI and machine learning are the hard skills. So the soft skills become part of the focus of what we develop in MBA curriculum. what are the conversations about what the curriculum will be at Stanford in 2025? Are you having those conversations? You know, what types of courses will be offered, and who will be teaching those, and do you need a new set of teaching skills to do that?
So one thing is, I actually see, I mean, I personally see less of a dichotomy between, I know that that's a common thing to delineate hard and soft skills. I see less of a sharp dichotomy between those types of skills. When I think about sort of what are the skills that I want the students to come with, they're holistic in a sense. Students ought to be able to communicate, but they ought to be able to communicate with empathy, and they ought to be able to communicate about analytic topics. Both. These are, it's sort of, to me, they blur together at some level. They're not, there's not a distinction between now I've got my analytical hat on and now I'm dealing with the people in my organization. You have to do all those things all at once, all the time, basically, as a leader of an organization. That you don't sort of switch back and forth. So I think in many, so what does that pertain to the future of the curriculum? I think part of it is, just thinking about how do we develop all of those components of all of those dimensions of students in a way that's balanced, that gives them the whole toolkit that they're going to need. And we've introduced a lot of classes that I think we didn't have 10 years ago at Stanford. For example, we did not teach communication very much at Stanford. It was sort of a co-curricular or extracurricular activity doing communication. Now our communication classes are some of our most highly enrolled classes. In fact, we have a writing class that's one of our most highly enrolled classes, taught by a former editor of the New York Times. And the students do amazing things in that class. We regularly, these days, have been having students publish op-eds in the New York Times and other newspapers based on projects that came out of that class. So it's sort of non-obvious skill, but of course that's a fabulous skill to be able to write well. And it's an incredible skill. So I think thinking about how you just build out those different different aspects of the curriculum that will strengthen different dimensions of the skills people need to be effective managers and effective leaders. Yeah.
My name is Bob Ailig, and I'm with Liaison International. And I just wanted to, I really don't have a question for you, but I'd like to thank you. 2 years ago, I participated in Stanford's inaugural executive development program for LGBTQ leaders. And Stanford set the standard for global graduate management education by hosting this for the first time. And there were upwards of 50 executives from all over the world, and it was a powerful experience, and the opportunity was incredible. And I just want to thank you for your leadership to make that happen. I would also say to you, as someone who has 3 degrees from Penn and Wharton and worked at Wharton and Penn for 20 years, I never thought I would make a donation to Stanford, but I did. It wasn't a big donation, but it was a donation.
That's okay. We care about participation in fundraising. Thank you for saying that. We're very proud of that program, and I'm so happy to hear you say that.
Hi, Ashwani Monga again. So thank you for those remarks. You talked about co-teaching, and like specifically you mentioned that class by Jennifer Acker, whom I know well, and I know her research, everything is far away from AI. So I was just wondering, how do you make this happen? How do you make co-teaching happen? And are there incentives in place? What do you do?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. So how does co-teaching happen? So that happens in a variety of ways. Sometimes the faculty very often it's faculty driven. The faculty member comes in and says, I've got an idea to co-teach a class, and I'd really like to do it with this person, and then we make that happen. Sometimes it comes from the dean's office. In that particular case, so that case with Jennifer and Feifei teaching together is not an outside person, it's another Stanford faculty. And that actually just came about because Feifei is my neighbor, and Feifei Li, who's an amazing computer scientist, is my neighbor, and we were having tea at my house one night, and I said, you should teach a class at the business school. I just love what you're saying about, our students would benefit from this. And then we went around and asked who on the faculty would be interested, and Jennifer was interested in doing it. So they come about in all kinds of serendipitous ways, and what we just try to mostly enable it. But we've been, I think that case is an interesting case where bring someone in from another Stanford school, and that's something actually we haven't historically done as much of, and we've been trying to do it. We have another class this year that it's not related to AI. It's on climate and sustainability, and we got a fellow who's a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and he's a fabulous climate sustainable person from the Earth School, David Lobel, to come teach a class. And in that case, we went out and got him a co-teacher who is of the former CEO of Cargill, Greg Page. And so we put them together to teach a class. And so that's another person from another Stanford school, which is something I think that's actually a great thing for our students to get exposed to some faculty from non-business school faculty who are terrific teachers and terrific researchers and scholars from other parts of the university. So I think that's what we're trying to do a little bit more of these days. You got one more.
I forget to mention my name. I'm PhD from Rutgers. I asked too many questions. My dean might go increase my salary.
You're on piece rate.
Yeah. My question is, I'm going to ask a very sensitive question now. Now, China and U.S. have a tariff fight.
Yes.
And this is my 50th year in the United States. But I fear for our manager, is not enough. It's time for our manager to know a little bit in depth about Chinese culture. What do you think?
Actually, I think that's a great question about. So the question was about how much do people need to know about China. So I was in China 2 days ago, and I've been there twice this fall. Right now our countries are obviously in a rocky period. But if you look at what's happening in China, it's really amazing. I mean, China, it has a population of 1.4 billion people. It's going to be the largest economy in the world within 25 years, and it's going to be the largest economy for most of this century. And it's creating businesses at an incredible rate. I don't know the exact numbers, but it probably has more unicorn companies than. It may have more unicorn companies than Silicon Valley right now. I don't know if that's exactly right, but it certainly would be comparable. So I think people would do well to pay attention to what's going on in China for lots of reasons. Great. Okay, thank you very much.